Well, the dark voice was telling me that this was my fault. That because I had picked Ronald's photograph out of a photographic lineup, that it was my fault. And to be truthful, the world, the justice world, the media world, the public world was very happy for me to carry that narrative because it was easy.
Yeah. White woman accuses black man. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was the stereotypical, all of that, like all of that. That was the story. And the trauma that caused in my life on many levels far outweighed what had been done to me on July 29th of 1984.
Feeling lost?
Then you're in the right place.
I'm Amanda Knox.
And I'm Christopher Robinson.
And this is Labyrinth.
On July 29th, 1984, Jennifer Thompson was raped at knifepoint by a man who broke into her apartment while she slept. He chased her through the night, then went on to rape another woman. It was an incredibly traumatizing event, but that trauma was only the beginning.
I was raped around 3 a.m. and by 5 a.m., I'm in total trauma mode. As you can imagine, I've gone to a hospital to get a rape kit done, which is, I've never gone through one. It's unbelievably dehumanizing and traumatic, particularly if they're not done by someone who's been trauma-informed, and that was the case for me. There's no trauma-informed. It was in the hospital that I heard the woman down the hall crying, which happened to be the second victim. So I knew that there had been 2 rapes by the same person that night. When I got to the police station that morning, and you have to remember, like, I'm not wearing my own clothes because I had run without clothes on, and somebody giving me like a pair of underwear. And it was just horrible. I find out that the first hospital had not completed the rape kit correctly. So they had to send me to a different hospital to have a second rape kit done.
Oh my God.
So I've been raped. I've had 2 rape kits done. I'm 22. No one's coming for me. Nobody. I'm alone. And then I go to the police station again to begin a composite sketch, right? Where someone, an officer is, back then, and I don't know, there's probably still departments that use what they call an identikit, which is just basically a big file box of tabs, and every tab would be your eyebrows, your eyelashes, your lips, your cheek, all the parts of our face, right? And you have maybe 75 to choose from of the lips, right? And 75 eyebrows. And so the officer's pulling them up. He's like, does this look like the eyebrows? And I'm like, no, they were bushier, or they were not as bushy. And you start putting together this face, right? These overlays of images of a face that tried to kill you.
Right. Ugh.
And when it was completed and the officer said, does this look like the man who raped you? I answered truthfully. I said, yes, it looks like the person who raped me.
3 days later, the police have a suspect, a man named Ronald Cotton.
He had actually just come out of prison in March of 1984. I was raped in July of 84. So he'd just come home after 18 months of being in prison for an attempted sexual assault. And there's lots of things we can talk about there. So that kind of put him up, as a person of interest. But the real thing was that both myself and the second survivor, and there had been a woman before me that had fortunately been able to call the police before she was raped, all described the same clothing, particularly the shirt and the gloves on this person's body. The second victim and I had pretty identical markers for the clothing. And a few days after the rape, the composite sketch had gone in the newspaper, and a phone call had come into the police department from a woman who said that she had seen Ronald Cotton on a bicycle outside of my apartment complex wearing the exact clothing that both of us had described.
Wow.
The gloves, the blue shirt with the white stripes on the sleeves, like all of it. And at the same time, like 3 a.m., like all of it, right? And so he did become the suspect.
But Jennifer doesn't know this at the time. She only knows that the police suspect someone because they call her in to look at a photo lineup.
So 3 days later, when I'm called to the police station to look at this 6-pack, 3-on-3 photos, and they gave me instructions that were fairly good. Suspect may or may not be in here. Take your time. Don't feel compelled. But you're 22, you're in the police station, there's 6 photographs, and you know that in one of those 6s, the police have a suspect. You know that, or I wouldn't have been called. And so when I picked up number 3, and they said, that's who we thought it was.
Right.
And then a week later, when I'm called back to the police station to do a physical lineup, I am brought into an abandoned schoolhouse to the 2nd floor for the physical lineup because the room was being renovated. And the only thing that separated me and the 7 men in the physical lineup was a folding table.
Oh, my God.
And the trauma that was bubbling up was I almost couldn't breathe. And as I'm looking at the 7 men in the lineup, I wrote down number 5 on the piece of paper. Again, the detective said, well, that's who you picked down the photograph.
And each time she identified Ronald Cotton as the perpetrator. And
so Ronald would be convicted in January of 1985 and given a life and 54 years.
Wow.
In Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's where he was initially housed. And then that was kind of it for me. I didn't really question whether the system got it right or wrong. As a crime survivor, you're trusting the system to give you the truth. And so you don't question any of that. And then 11 years later, I was visited by the original investigator and the new assistant district attorney of Alamance County here in North Carolina about a DNA test and that I needed to give a new blood sample because it's been 11 years now. But again, they assured me that Ronald was the person who had committed these crimes. There had been 2 rapes that night. We knew it was the same person. So they assured me we'd gotten it right. And again, you don't question that. And that would be in March of 1995. And then they came back in June, the first week of June, and told me that the DNA test had not only revealed that it had not been Ronald Cotton, that Ronald was innocent, all this time, but that it was a man by the name of Bobby Poole who was now a serial rapist and had been left out in the community during that time and committed 24 more violent crimes, 6 of which were first-degree rapes. And my life really, truly fell apart and disintegrated and, became almost paralyzed with fear and anger and all the things that, human beings experience in these times of crisis and conflicts and chaos. There really was zero roadmap at that time. We're talking about 1995, and we were just barely talking about DNA. We were just barely talking about wrongful convictions and all the complexities and the things that can lead to a wrongful conviction. So I didn't know it. I didn't know there was a thing called exonerees. So it was a really scary time for me. It was a dark time for me. My triplets were 5. So, you can't get but so lost when you've got these little people that need you. And I can remember being able to do the daily things that parents have to do. You get them up, you feed them breakfast, you wash their clothes, you do the things that you need to do as a parent. And I could do those, but it was the other stuff that at night when the children would go to sleep that I was absolutely lost.
What's going through your mind? What's the dark voice telling you inside yourself?
Well, the dark voice was telling me that this was my fault. that because I had picked Ronald's photograph out of a photographic lineup, that it was my fault. And to be truthful, the world, the justice world, the media world, the public world was very happy for me to carry that narrative because it was easy.
Yeah. White woman accuses black man. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was the stereotypical, all of that, like all of that. That was the story, and the trauma that caused in my life on many levels far outweighed what had been done to me on July 29th of 1984.
Yeah, I'm curious actually to go back to that moment when the DA came and told you about the results of the DNA, because that was a moment when someone within that organization who is supposedly on the side of the victim is going to come in and support you in some way. Did they at all, when they brought this information to you, give you any insight or support as to what kind of things you might be facing now that the truth had come out?
No, I mean, the only thing that they said was that they would try to protect me from the media.
Did they?
Well, they did to a degree. I mean, I had gotten married, so my name had been changed. So that was a little helpful. Eventually the media found me, but for the next year, when Ronald would do interviews and television shows, because he was the first. This was the first case in the country where a DNA test had exonerated an innocent person, but also been a hit on the guilty person. And Ronald was like the 23rd exoneree in the country using DNA. So it was relatively new, and certainly, everybody was kind of clamoring to get the story. But when Ronald would do his interviews and television, the question was always, "Where's the girl? Have you heard from the girl? What does the girl think? What does the girl say? Is the girl sorry? The girl." And I was really trying hard to not let them find me. So I tried to make myself really very, very small.
Mm.
It was easy for the world to blame me. It was like a quick answer. They didn't have to, really challenge themselves to think deeper about it. It was like, yeah, Jennifer did it. That's good. Done. Let's hold her accountable. And it was really very, very hard. And I know that you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the death threats I've gotten, the hate that I've gotten has been really terrible. And it's not just me. Most of our rape survivors from these cases receive death threats and just horrible things that are said to them.
Here you are. Ronald Cotton's on the TV telling his story. Everyone's like, what does that girl who wrongly accused you think? Did he ever have anything to say about you, or was he just asking questions? Like, do you remember anything that his perspective early on?
I tried not to pay attention to it. Like, if I knew he was on television, I actually didn't watch it or read articles about it. Not because I didn't care, but I just didn't want to read the narrative because my narrative had now been completely erased out of my own story. So now my story's been erased, and I don't even exist, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The way I was discovered was Barry Scheck.
That is Barry Scheck, the co-founder of the Original Innocence Project.
Was looking for a story from a case where a victim had participated in an identification procedure and it had failed. Fallibility of eyewitness ID. And there was a man in Boston that worked for Frontline that wanted to do a documentary about the fallibility of eyewitness ID. And Barry and I didn't know Barry. I mean, everybody knew Barry, but I didn't know Barry. Had told Ben, like, if you can find this girl, Jennifer Thompson, might be a good story. And so somehow this guy ended up finding me. And I met him. He came to my house. I made Mike Golden come. I was scared, and told me that he wanted to do this thing, and promised me that he'd be respectful and whatever. And I was really not interested. I was like, you know what? Why would I want to tell my story for you to put it in a documentary so that 10 million people hate me? Like, that sounds like a really terrible idea to me. And he said, well, Ronald's going to tell his story. And I didn't want somebody else telling my story. So I felt like I had to tell my story. And so I agreed that I would do it on the grounds that Ronald and I do it in separate towns, which we were living in separate cities anyway. And he agreed to that. And the night that it aired in February of 1997, Ronald says, I know that she's sorry, but I really want to hear it from her. And the last thing I said was, I know he's innocent, but I still see him in my nightmares. And that was kind of the impetus, really, for me to understand that if I didn't take some type of step forward, that I would stay in this place, which was really actually killing me.
Hi, listeners. If you're enjoying Labyrinths, I think you'd love my new book, Free, My Search for Meaning. Even after I was released from prison, I still felt trapped in the story that had taken over my life. Free is about my journey to reclaim my identity and the mistakes and misadventures I had in trying to create my own freedom. It's also a guide to resilience, post-traumatic growth, and making peace with the past. Go to amandaknox.com to pre-order your copy of Free today.
After hearing Ronald Cotton's interview, Jennifer knew she had to meet him. So she contacted Detective Mike Alden, the detective from the case.
Once this piece aired, everybody wanted to find me. Literally everybody wanted to find me. And so I was afraid. And I asked him if he would set a private meeting where Ronald didn't even know where we were going, and I didn't know where I was going, so we couldn't leak it to somebody. And that was, kind of for me, the first step in trying to heal. Ronald and I had been on this kind of like parallel trajectory of harm. Like, we both were just super failed, and his family was super failed, and my family was really failed. And when I asked for an opportunity to meet with him, and of course, I didn't know if he was going to want that. He was very eager for it. And we met in April of 1997, about a mile from where I'd been raped 13 years prior. If you've never met Ronald, he's huge. He's 6'4". He's just huge. I'm 5'1". I mean, it's just like this very strange, like when you see us together. And he just came walking into the room, and, you try to come up with, like, what am I going to say? And what is he going to say? And how am I going to say it? And, and then the moment happens and you forget everything you were going to say. And so the only thing I could do was just start crying, and told him how sorry I was for what happened to him. And he started to cry, and he was like, I am so sorry for what happened to you. And we took each other's hands, and we started to cry. And I think one of the things that was so amazing about it, and the opportunity for other, reconciliation moments, is that I could answer things for Ronald that only I could answer. And he could answer things for me that only Ronald could answer. And that's that beautiful moment of repair, of restoration, of reconciliation, that only we could give to each other, right?
What kind of things was that? What was that thing that only you could give Ronald and Ronald could give you?
Well, his question was, obviously, Jennifer, why did you think it was me? And I was able to kind of tell him about what the process had been like, and that this was something I was told when I picked out your photograph, that that's who we thought it was. And, your alibi didn't work. And, you'd given the wrong dates to the, you got things confused. And so the way that was told to me was, he's a liar.
Right.
It's that stuff that the courts do to us when they put us on opposite sides of the courtroom. And I could tell them about the things that were said to me, and the things that I needed to, weirdly, I wanted to know, like, it was like, well, then where were you that night? Because you said you were here, but you weren't there. Then you said you were over here. And, he was like, I really actually was here. Jennifer, I was 22 years old, Ronald, if you know Ronald, he uses rhymes for everything. And he was like, I just needed to slow my Mustang down, and I didn't know where I was most of the time. I was just out there partying, enjoying life. I wasn't keeping up a calendar or
right.
I don't know. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that kind of makes sense,
Yeah.
It was those little things that both of us needed to know. And honestly, at the end of the 2 hours, we just embraced and we hugged and we cried and we exchanged contact information, and we promised that we were going to be friends, and that because we had lived this and survived it together, the same person had hurt both of us. I mean, and that's the other thing that we really don't talk about, right? Is Bobby Poole tried to destroy me that night. He tried to destroy another woman that night. He really, really wreaked havoc in a lot of women's lives in that community. But he also knew that an innocent man had been arrested for the crimes that he committed, and he was perfectly fine with that. But Bobby Poole, no matter where I've ever spoken, and Amanda, I don't know, I've spoken to 5,000 audiences, over my lifetime, maybe more. Not one person has ever said, oh my God, Bobby Poole really, really hurt both of you.
Ugh.
And again, with you, right? There's a person who hurt Meredith. So, he just, oh God, I sometimes can't even think about it with Meredith. But he also knew that you had been arrested and your friend had been arrested. And this guy was perfectly fine to allow that to happen. And yet, why aren't we blaming this person for all the harm that he created in all these lives?
At this point, Jennifer still largely blamed herself for what happened to Ronald Cotton, but she was beginning to recognize the role of the state and of the police.
I want to go back to this idea that, and to your point, it's much easier to just blame you and say, oh, Jennifer knowingly and willingly accused the innocent guy, who knows why, because she just wanted somebody to go to prison, so it didn't really matter as long as it was somebody. And so that's sort of the narrative that's put out there. And I'm curious to know, in that story, in that narrative, the state is this sort of faceless, neutral, sort of non-existent party in the whole scenario. It's as if the only thing that happened was between you and Ronald. Again, this idea that you put somebody in prison, not the state put somebody in prison because you had been a victim of a crime. Right. So there's this idea that the state somehow magically disappears from this scenario and doesn't have any sort of responsibility or accountability in it because they are just a faceless vehicle of between you and Ronald. And obviously that is not true. And I'm curious to know, did anyone from the the police, the prosecution, and a victim's rights advocate who is working within that system, who had been worked with you at all, did any of them ever stand up for you in the face of that narrative of Jennifer's to blame? Did any of them attempt to take any of the accountability on themselves, or were they too also happy for you to take the blame?
I'll be honest with you. Mike Alden, who had been the detective that night, the night of the crime, who eventually became captain of the Burlington Police Department, who eventually became chief of the police department, has been and will always be probably up there among one of my greatest heroes. He has oftentimes said, Jennifer, I mean, this has been later when we've been unpacking, Jennifer, like we did this, like the Burlington Police Department did this, like Ronald was our suspect. We put Ronald in the lineup. We gave you confirmation bias and strong confirmation bias when I picked up his photograph and was told that's who we thought it was. I mean, like, wow, that's really big. When you're told that by the investigators, it's like, oh, good.
Yeah. Wink, wink, yeah. This
blink,
guy.
Blink, blink, lights go off, confetti and everything. It's like, you did it. That's kind of the way it was. And for a lot of years, I thought maybe I had misremembered. Maybe that really didn't happen. And it wasn't until, it was several years ago, we were on a panel and Mike Alden was there. And I said, Mike, I got to ask you, you did say that to me that night? And he said, yeah, I did say that to you that night, and it was wrong. So he, has always been kind of one of my dear champions, and did incredible work across the state and across the country in changing the way identification procedures are done. So he really is a hero up there. But then that was kind of it. I mean, for them, but then everybody else was just, it was either the narrative was, that it was my fault because I'm obviously a racist white woman. I mean, obviously, or rape isn't so bad, and so you're fine.
Right. This is something that you and I have in common, is having been put through an experience by the police that resulted in the wrongful arrest of an innocent man. And you got blamed for it. I got blamed for it. Still blamed for it. And it's and like the insinuation being that like you don't care, and that you did it because you're just a racist white bitch. Not that you were hurt and that you were harmed and that you would never have done this had it not been for whatever you had gone through.
Right.
Like the immediate jump to conclusion that there was malicious intent.
Jennifer felt compelled to advocate for change. So she and Ronald did events together. But even then, she still often found herself absorbing responsibility for the injustice that befell him.
Especially if I was with Ron. I mean, especially with Ron, because, somebody would raise their hand and yes, the question every single time, 100% of the time it would be, Jennifer, Ron, first of all, I want to say thank you so much. You're like amazing. You're like Jesus on stage. And Jennifer, my question to you is like, how do you live with yourself?
Oh my God.
And it would be every single time. And at first, I would try to be polite about it. And I would just say, well, I'm trying to do this work. I'm trying to make the system better. I'm trying to make it more equitable. I'm trying to make it fair.
There's a lot of pain and self-blame that's happening internally, you to yourself. But there's also that blame that's coming externally. People who are now treating you like the villain when you have been a victim.
Right.
Talk to me about that.
I mean, it was a complete narrative shift. Because for 11 years, it was clear that I had been the victim of the sexual assault rape, all of that. And then in 1995, when Ronald was exonerated, it was a flipping of the story. It was a flipping of the script. It was Ronald now had become a victim of the criminal justice system, and Jennifer had become the perpetrator of that. It was incredibly heavy and scary to carry. When I look back on it, I get angry about it because somebody should have been there protecting me and helping me to understand the causation of what had happened. That, and one of the things I work really hard on is dispelling myths. And one of the myths is that somehow crime survivors and victims from these cases just seriously don't care if there's an innocent person who goes to prison, which is absolutely ridiculous. Your crime victims and survivors want the person who hurt them or their loved ones to be held accountable. We absolutely do not want innocent people to go to prison. And it cannot be a victim or survivor's fault. Because the reality is, Ronald could never have gone to prison had Bobby Poole not raped me. But that wasn't the story out there. The story was, Jennifer, white Southern, you got to throw the Southern in there, white Southern girl. And it wasn't just, and there was no words of like mistaken. It was literally the narrative, Amanda, was white rape victim falsely accuses an innocent Black man and sends him to prison not once but twice. And people were really eager to take that narrative and go, yes, that is what happened. It took me a long time to be able to push back on that, to say, well, okay, hold up. I can't send anybody to prison. If I had that kind of power, Amanda, there'd be some people in prison. I don't have that kind of power. So, I can't send anybody to prison. The state of North Carolina did. And I didn't put Ronald Cotton's photograph in a lineup. Like, I didn't do any of that.
Yeah.
But probably the most important thing is that I needed to understand what had happened to my memory. And that's something no one explained to me. And I didn't understand it for another 6 years. But in those 6 years, I was paraded all across the country. You know this. Putting on stage and tell your story and vomit your trauma to the world. Help us change the system and move procedures and policies. And so for many years, I was really used as like, the whipping boy. And I took the pummels from, the world when we talked about, rape cases and wrongful convictions. Again, I didn't have a different narrative, so I accepted it until one day I listened to Gary Wells.
Dr. Gary Wells holds a PhD in experimental social psychology with a specialization in the reliability of eyewitness testimony. His recent work includes investigations into ways in which the structure of lineups affects their reliability and the factors that lead eyewitnesses to develop false confidence in their memories. This research has helped reveal why mistaken eyewitness identification is one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions.
When I listened to him talk about confirmation bias, about contaminated memory, about double-blind administration on these IDs, on sequential versus simultaneous lineups, like all the stuff that cross-racial ID, like all the things that happened that night for me. That was the first time that I sat back and thought, oh my God, wait a minute. This was not my fault. This was not my fault.
And the first crucial step in her memory being contaminated was that composite sketch, done in the immediate wake of her trauma by a police sketch artist.
It's an image, it's a likeness, it's a composite sketch. And what most people don't realize is by that moment, my memory was already contaminated.
Right.
Right? Because it's not his eyebrows. It's not his nose. I mean, I often ask audiences because they look at me like, I don't understand. You were this close and you tried really hard and weren't drinking alcohol or under the influence of alcohol and drugs. I always ask people to raise their hand if they've had a mom. When everybody raises their hands, everybody's got a mom. And then I ask them, how many millions and millions and millions of times have you looked at your mother's face? Can you tell me exactly what her right ear looks like? Right? I mean, our brains don't encode things like that, and we actually cannot compartmentalize our faces. Like nobody compartmentalizes faces because we look at things in totality. Like that's Amanda Knox's face, but I wouldn't be able to tell you tomorrow that those are your eyebrows, right? And I've seen you hundreds of times. So that was the beginning of the contamination. And so now I have this original image of the person who did this to me, and I have a composite sketch. And the best I can explain it is they're smushed together.
That contaminated memory, a jumble of her actual memory of Bobby Poole's face mashed up with the image created by the sketch artist, is then further contaminated by the photo lineup.
So 3 days later, when I'm called to the police station to look at this 6-pack, 3-on-3 photos.
Right.
And so when I picked up number 3 and they said, that's who we thought it was. Then the image that I had that night of Bobby Poole, anything, was now gone, and it's replaced with a photograph of Ronald Cotton.
Remember that Bobby Poole was not in this lineup, and had he been, this may have been a moment to undo the memory contamination from the composite sketch. As it was, Ronald Cotton's face was in this lineup, and the police already suspected him. Recall that Jennifer and the other victim gave matching descriptions of the rapist's clothing, and that after the composite sketch was published in the newspaper, a witness called in to say she'd seen Ronald Cotton at 3 a.m. in the vicinity of the rapes, wearing that exact clothing.
We found out years later that this woman who had called in had been promised charges against she and her son for drugs being dropped if she would make that phone call and give that identification. And, like so many of the victims and survivors in these cases, what we call original crime victims, we don't know this stuff is happening over here. You're just trusting that whoever's giving you this information, that it's true and factual.
That incentivized information biased the police, who in turn biased Jennifer, solidifying in her memory the image of Ronald Cotton.
And as I'm looking at the 7 men in the lineup, I think that I'm remembering the image of a week and a half ago. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to find the photograph that I found last week.
Yeah.
And I don't know that. It's all subconscious. And when I wrote down number 5 on the piece of paper, again, the detective said, well, that's who you picked down the photograph. Bobby Poole's image was forever erased out of my memory. And it was, transplanted was Ronald Cotton. And that's how memory works.
Hi, listeners. This May, I'm going to be leading a resilience retreat where I'm going to talk about my practices for building resilience in the face of adversity. It's going to be a very close-knit community of people who are overcoming hardship and attempting to regain agency in their own lives and their own stories. Please join us here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest for 4 days of focused, resilience-based training in a safe and supportive space. It's going to be both fun and rewarding. So go to amandaknox.com to find out more, and I hope to see you there.
As Jennifer came to understand how her memory had been contaminated by flawed police procedures, she continued to advocate with Ronald against wrongful convictions. And in 2009, the two of them wrote a book together called Picking Cotton, which became a New York Times bestseller. But even then, Jennifer still didn't quite have the words to push back against the narrative of her own guilt.
I'm curious to know when that shifted for you, when you started standing up to that narrative.
Yeah, thank you, because that is a great question. I was beginning to kind of be able to push back on the narrative, not hugely successful, but a little bit. But in 2013, the Innocence Network had their conference in Charlotte, North Carolina. And, I'm from North Carolina. So Katie Monroe, who we know is an incredible human being, at this time was working for the Innocence Project in New York. And she decided to create the very first Victims' Voices panel at a network. And she invited myself, a young woman named Yolanda, whose sister was brutally murdered here in North Carolina, and Christy Shepard, whose cousin was brutally raped and murdered in Ada, Oklahoma. And so she invited the three of us to participate on this panel. And, like always, the three of us went and you just kind of like anticipate the script. Tell us about your story. Tell us how it started. Tell us how you felt. And instead, Katie said and asked the question, how has the wrongful conviction harmed you? And I started crying, like sobbing, because no one had ever realized that the wrongful conviction had caused tremendous harm to me in my life and tremendous harm to Yolanda's family and to Christy's family. No one had ever allowed us to say that had harmed us, right? Because up until that point, the only harm caused by wrongful convictions were to an innocent man or woman.
Right.
And the story ends there. And at the end of that panel, it really made me pivot and shift. That was that moment for me where I was like, I'm going to shift and pivot right here. And that's where healing justice was born and conceived. I mean, that was like, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be something different. And how do we create those spaces to allow for all of the harm?
Because it wasn't just the harm that you experienced was not just the fact that you were raped at knife point and your life, you almost died that night. It was, then you went on to have a failure of a criminal justice experience, and to all of that blame and all of that narrative, all of that was part of your trauma. And like you said earlier, potentially even more devastating to you personally than even the rape itself.
Yeah. Exactly. And, Amanda, you know this. I mean, when you went to prison, it wasn't just you that got harmed. I mean, your family they were devastated. They missed 4 years of building memories with you. They missed 4 years of creating opportunities with you. But Meredith, I mean, she didn't just die. She was brutally and violently removed from this earth. And that family, her family, every day has to wonder, what were those last moments of life like for her? And what were her last thoughts? And who did she call out for? Those are the things that we're kind of like not being honest about in this space, that there's so many people that are harmed when the system fails. And because we've been talking about it in that singular narrative, which is not truthful and it's not honest, we're missing like a lot of opportunities to really create, I think, large-scale systemic changes, but also to build opportunities into large-scale healing.
Now, when Jennifer gets the inevitable question, how do you live with yourself? She knows how to respond.
Now I just say, I'm going to assume that you didn't hear the first part of this story, where I was raped at knife point and almost killed and chased in the dark by a man with a knife who went on to rape a second person. So how do I live with myself? Like, I live with myself fine, because I didn't do anything wrong that night. I didn't do anything wrong. And I will never carry that ever again. And I don't want crime survivors and victims to carry that ever again. I don't want exonerees to have to carry that when someone looks at them and says, well, you were doing drugs? What did you think was going to happen? Get arrested. I'm like, okay, but the person didn't commit murder, and don't we want the person who did commit the murder to actually go to prison? And like, that doesn't make any sense. So now, I won't attach myself to that narrative, but I did for a very, very long time.
Do you even know how to talk about your, what you are accountable for versus what the police and the detectives are accountable for?
Honestly, what I say these days is my job that night was to live. And that's the end. My job was not to solve the case. My job was not to find the suspect. My job was not to gather up 12 people to be the jury. That was not my job. My job that night was to live and survive.
Right.
That's it. That's
Period.
it. Yeah. Since then, what is my job? What I attempt to do and try to do really seriously every day is try to create equity in these stories. Because what we have now, and you know this better than anybody, what we have today is either I can care about the exonerated person, or I can care about the crime victims, but I can't care about both of them.
This has even been an issue within the innocence movement.
I think when that line got thrown out to me, that lifeline that you alluded to, it felt like, these are my people. They get it, they understand. But in truth, in actuality, the innocence community has done an equal amount of harm to me.
Yeah.
Not with intent, I don't think, but they perpetuated the language and the narrative and the story that I sent Ronald to prison. And I still, Amanda, this is 2024, closing in on, we're going to 2025. And I still have to, when people send me introductions that they're going to do with me, I have to send it back. I'm like, no, you can't use that language. No, that's wrong language. That insinuates this, it insinuates that. And these are really smart people, and I care about them a lot. And but they've been doing this for a long time, and they're still going, oh, I never thought about that word having that kind of weight and energy and, and association to it. And so I'm still having to correct people. And I don't anymore really do it for me because, I've just gotten to, I'm 62 and I'm just like, yeah, I'm not putting up with that. But There's all these new victims that are, that are being discovered. And I will do it for them because A, it's not true. It's not truthful. And B, it is really hurtful. And at the end of the day, one of the things I've really discovered in this work that you and I do in this very complex, strange world of wrongful convictions is that this adversarial nature that that's baked into the cake of our criminal legal system has just oozed over into the innocence community. It is still so adversarial. Even when we get into these exoneration procedures, even when we get into the media surrounding these stories, it's still they're wanting to blame people and pit victims and survivors against innocent men and women and their families. I'm like, to what end? To what end?
What could the innocence community do to make up for how it harmed you? What do you need from the innocence community?
When these cases are now being undone, they can begin by changing the language they use surrounding victims and survivors,
Mm.
and making sure that media doesn't engage in additional harm of the victims and survivors. And we have a ton of resources on our website that's there for the innocence community. We have a handbook for exonerating family members. It's in our website that very few people ever use. And it's there, it's free for any innocence project to hand to clients. So we have tons of resources that are just there that we want people to use and know about and understand. And then I guess lastly is this capacity to expand empathy, right? And I had this moment with another innocent project leader that I suggested that, that love is limitless, right? I mean, you love both of your children. You love your husband. There's like infinite amounts of love that Amanda Knox can give to people. Same with empathy. Like, it's not this finite thing. And we don't have to just hold it for the innocent person. We can give this empathy to everybody that's been harmed in these situations. And this person looked at me and she was like, you know what? The victims get everything. And so I'm just not going to care about them. And I'm only going to give empathy to exonerees. And I was like, okay, all right then.
So tell me about healing justice and tell me about restorative justice. So first of all, what does healing justice do? And how does restorative justice play a role in that? And what even is that?
Yeah. Well, let me answer restorative justice first, because I think that's important. I mean, restorative justice is, really very ancient work that has been done for hundreds and hundreds of years by Native First people, First Nations, Maori individuals. Like, they've done that. That's how their government worked, right? They would bring people together in a circle. There's a harmed person and there's a person who's committed harm, and they ask 3 questions. And the 3 questions are to the victim, the person who's been harmed: how were you harmed? What do you need? And whose obligation is it to repair the harm that was created to you? So it's all victim-centered. And originally it was victim-centered, placing the victim's need front and center, and the person who's created the harm is required to repair that, right? So that's what restorative justice is. Unbeknownst to me, Ronald and I had kind of done that on our first meeting. We were able to sit together. Now, both of us were harmed, but we were able to name our harms. We were able to speak what we needed, and we were able to give that to each other. So I talked about Katie doing that victims panel in 2013, and it really got me thinking of why aren't there spaces for exonerated individuals, their families, and the victims from these cases and their families to come together and use restorative justice as a way to repair, the brokenness that the system created. Because in true restorative justice, what we would be able to do is bring the person who actually committed the crime in front and be held responsible for all these people, the victims, the families, the exonerated person, their families. But very rarely, as you know, the perpetrator, the actual perpetrator, is never found. So it's almost impossible to hold them accountable. So then someone would say, well, then it's the system that should be held accountable. But you and I both know the system's not going to step forward and go, yeah, we effed all this up.
Yeah, the system doesn't like to be held accountable, as it turns out.
So that's not going to happen. So can we bring a restorative justice approach and principles and guidelines to this very unique group of individuals that have been so harmed for years and years and decades? And so I piloted with David Onick, who you may remember was the executive director of the Northern California Innocence Project. And then a very, very special restorative justice practitioner named Sujatha. The three of us sat together and said, is this possible? And Sujatha was like, I think it is. And we kind of figured out what a test pilot would look like. And we launched it in December of 2014. And it was magical. When we brought exonerees and crime victims together. Now, these were not the victims from their cases. So you can use surrogates in those kind of situations. That's what we did. It was magical. And so in April of 2015, the Department of Justice awarded me and Ronald the Special Courage Award. And that's when I decided to launch Healing Justice, having absolutely no idea what I was doing, by the way. It's just like, I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. It's a nonprofit. What does that mean? I don't know.
We'll figure it out later.
Idea. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But I did know enough to hire Katie Monroe to be our executive director. That much I knew. And for those that are listening, Katie's mother was wrongfully convicted of first-degree murder when she was 55 years old, and was sentenced to prison. And Katie had just graduated law school and spent the next 12 years to bring her mother home. And because Katie had a lived experience and a shared experience, I knew that she understood the heart of this work. So Healing Justice is the only organization in the country that works to address the harm caused by wrongful convictions to everybody. And the way we do that is by building equity in stories and narratives so that everyone's harms are heard and given opportunity to speak what they need, and try to repair that. And we do a lot of work in the criminal legal space with trainings for prosecutors' offices, DA's offices, attorney generals, conviction integrity units, trying to train them on how to notify these victims and survivors from these cases when the cases are getting ready to be reviewed and overturned, so that we can reduce as much as possible additional trauma that's created. And then our healing work is really bringing individuals together that have had, these shared harms, and work in restorative spaces, creating peer support. It's pretty amazing, and to me, it's the thing that I love to do the most.
If you want to hear more about Jennifer's journey with Ronald Cotton, look up the New York Times bestseller, Picking Cotton, a memoir of injustice and redemption, written by Jennifer, Ronald Cotton, and Aaron Torneo. And you can learn more about Jennifer's organization, Healing Justice, at healingjusticeproject.org.
In the meantime, get lost with us. Find us on Bluesky at amandaknox.com.
At wisecracker.bsky.social.
You can help support our work just by following or subscribing to Labyrinths wherever you listen to your podcasts. And sign up for our free newsletter at amandaknox.com to get the latest on all our work.
Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. This episode was written and produced by us. Our managing producer is Andre Sapp, our assistant producer is Charlie Darnell, and our theme music is by Josh Budo Karp.